So in spite of the groundbreaking progress accomplished by scholars of Ismaili studies in the past decades, the progress the present conference testifies to, much remains to be done, as many periods of Ismaili history and many areas of Ismaili thought remains unexplored. Among these, the Fatimid period is seemingly one of the most privileged one in Ismaili history due to the quantity of sources and studies discussing the history and thought of this dynasty. Yet, a history of Fatimid thought is still to be produced. In this regard, the reign of al-Mu'izz is decisive, as it seems that the Imam had a deep interest in the intellectual aspects of the dawah, that is, in advocating the legitimacy of the Fatimid imamate from an intellectual perspective, as opposed to a merely military or political perspectives. Indeed, this reign is characterized by a series of ideological reforms, among which are the creation of an Ismaili fiqh, which al-Qadi Nu'man was in charge of, the reform of the Fatimid genealogy, so Muhammad ibn Ismail was introduced as an ancestor of the Fatimid caliphs, according to Madlung in his famous article. And also this reign is also characterized by several attempts to bring under Fatimid authority other Ismaili groups, and he endeavored to operate a rapprochement between the Western and the Eastern Dawas, and apparently as a result, Abu Yaqub al-Sijistani, towards the end of his career, acknowledged the Fatimid authority. Among these ideological reforms, one should also count the adoption of Neoplatonism, as several sources dating from this reign suddenly appear, containing Neoplatonic features, and this is something that has recently been studied by Daniel de Smet and David Hollenberg. Indeed, while Neoplatonism was a major feature of the speculations of the Eastern Dais, it is totally absent from the Fatimid Ismaili sources before the reign of al-Mu'izz. This, of course, raises several questions, such as the nature of the relationship between the Eastern Dawah, what Madlung had labeled the Persian school, and the Western Dawah, so the Fatimids, before and after the proclamation of the Fatimid imamate. The sudden appearance of Neoplatonic concepts in Fatimid ideology also raises another question. Is it a coincidence that this occurs about the same time as al-Sijistani's allegiance to the Fatimids? So it seems unlikely. And although I cannot establish the exact nature of the connection, I will attempt at the end of this presentation to present some arguments pointing to the existence of such a connection. So in this presentation, I will start by briefly discussing the largely understudied corpus attributed to Ja'far ibn Manṣūr al-Yaman and the problems it raises, particularly with regard to authorship. I will then specifically address two of the works in this corpus, which, as I will demonstrate, are by the same author, whether this author is indeed Ja'far or not. And in the final part of the presentation, I will point to some common features between these two works and some aspects of al-Sijistani's thought, thus raising the matter of his possible influence on Fatimid Ismaili thought. So let's start with Ja'far ibn Manṣūr al-Yaman and his corpus. So Ja'far is a Fatimid da'i, an intellectual who served the first four Fatimid caliphs. We know very little about him. Actually, all the biographical data that we have about him can be summarized in one slide. We don't even know when he was born, when he died. So probably died towards shortly after the middle of the 10th century. So I'll be very quick on this and go directly to his corpus. So in this slide, I have tried to roughly organize the corpus that is attributed to him, based on the list that was established by Professor Poonawala in his famous bibliography. So I've tried to organize this corpus in several groups. The first one is what we could call the historical Ja'far. So those are works that attest to a historical figure that is Ja'far. The other two main groups, so here in green and blue, are works of esoteric interpretation. There are works of They're not works of history, they're works of ta'wil, of Ismaili thought. So I've set apart here the Kitab al-Alim wal-Ghulam, the master which was translated and published by the IAS by James Morris under the title The Master and the Disciple, because it is a work that really stands out in this corpus, and it doesn't seem likely to be the same, written by the same author as the rest of the books. Then I have identified what I call a core group form of these list of books, with the last two books in the list here. Obviously, they pose a little more problems, so I will not really engage with this. What interests us here is the fact that in these books, those that I've put in bold characters here, some of these books contain Neoplatonic features, while the other are completely or almost completely free from any philosophical vocabulary. It is thus interesting to note that the main dichotomy in this corpus, well, at least in the corpus in the books of Ismaili thought, is between a group containing philosophical concepts and a cosmology similar to that of the Eastern Dawah on the one hand, so here in blue, and a corpus that does not contain these features on the other hand. So the criterion to distinguish these two groups is the same as the one that distinguished Eastern Dawah productions on the one hand and Fatimid productions on the other hand, at least before the reign of al-Mu'izz. So I'll focus here on the two works from this corpus that stand out in various respects, and that I attribute to a single author. So given the state of our knowledge of this corpus, it cannot be ascertained which of these works can really be attributed to Ja'far ibn Manṣūr al-Yaman and how many authors we are dealing with exactly. But as I will establish, at least the Sarā'ir al-nuṭaqā and the Ta'wil al-zakāt are by the same author, whether he is indeed Ja'far or not. So why does these two works stand out? There are several aspects that can be compared several aspects of these two works that can be compared, some of which also compare with other works attributed to Ja'far. So here there's this distinction to be made between similarities due to the fact that these texts all belong to a common tradition, and similarities due to the fact that they're written by a unique single author. So here we'll try to focus on some specific aspects, themes, interpretations, or expressions that are not found in other works attributed to Ja'far, and therefore are indications of a single authorship for these two works, namely the Ta'wil al-Zakāt and Sarā'ir al-nuṭaqā. So we'll focus on two passages, mention a few other common themes, and finally I will present hard evidence for this attribution. So first of all, there is evidence that these two works are to be dated from the reign of al-Mu'izz. The Ta'wil al-Zakāt indeed explicitly mentions al-Mu'izz, while the Sarā'ir al-nuṭaqā mentions Muhammad ibn Ismail, and as we have seen, the reintroduction of Muhammad ibn Ismail in the official Fatimid genealogy is a reform that is to be dated from the reign of al-Mu'izz, according to Madloum. A first passage that I would like to discuss, well, two parallel passages, concern the story of Adam, the tree, and the fall. So both these books mention this Quranic episodes, and in both texts they both start by saying that by providing the interpretations of this episode by, on the one hand, the people of exotericism, al-Zāhir, and on the other hand, the Shia. So for the people of the exotericism and what they call the experts in histories and biographies, Ashab al-Tawarikh wa ulama al-Siyar, or Arbab al-Tawarikh wa Siyar, they say that this is Shajarat al-Burr, which I have not been able to identify botanically. And the Shia, on the other hand, say that it is the tree is the Qa'im. In the Sarā'ir al-nuṭaqā, the author explains that the Shia positions in some detail, and indulges it to some extent. He says the Shia are close to what the tree actually means. But what he really likes about the Shi'i position is that he admits the principle that over-obedience is disobedience. So what this his story means for the Shia is that Adam aimed for a rank higher than his own, namely the rank of the Qa'im. But the author of the Sarā'ir says that this approach contradicts the proper ta'wil, and then both texts provide a slightly different narrative of what is the proper ta'wil of this episode, but the general framework is actually identical. In both texts, the garden is the dawah, the tree is an enemy of the dawah. Adam's fault is to have initiated the enemy, which means that he revealed to him the esoteric knowledge of the dawah, and the fall is the expulsion of Adam from the dawah. Of course, in the Quran, Adam is reinstated; he is forgiven by God, and this is the same here. Adam is forgiven by the master, by the imam, after his fault. Okay, so another aspects. Sorry, I just wanted to make a short remark here on the expression "ashab al-tawarikh wal-siyar." So this is a very peculiar expression that does not appear in other books attributed to Ja'far, but is always here everywhere in both the Sarā'ir al-nuṭaqā and the Ta'wil al-zakāt. Every time the author wants to refute the Ahl al-Zāhir, he calls them the Ahl al-Tawarikh wal-Siyar, so people, the experts in history and biographies, and then he refutes them and says this is the Ismaili creed on this matter, and this is the actual meaning of this whatever episode he's commenting. Okay, so another striking expression here is this idea that too much obedience is disobedience. So in both texts, although with regard to different episodes, we have this very specific expression that al-ziyada fi ta'a isyan, that to over-obey beyond obedience is insubordination. So in the Sarā'ir al-nuṭaqā, this concerns Adam. In the Ta'wil al-zakāt, this concerns Moses when he asks God to see him, to be able to see him. Other common themes between these two works include the use of philosophical and Gnostic vocabulary, a certain cosmology to which I will return, but expressions like al-hudud al-ruhaniyya al-ulwiyya, al-hudud al-jismaniyya al-sufliyya, so like the higher spiritual ranks and the lower corporeal ranks, the opposition between kawn and fasad, which mean generation and corruption, so these are philosophical concepts. The oppositions between latif and kathif, the use of subtle and thick. The use of the term jawhar, substance, which is also philosophical term. All of these terms are again absent from the rest of the corpus attributed to Ja'far. In both texts, we have a doctrine of potentiality and actuality. That is, so again, two philosophical concepts which are correlated to the respective missions of the Nāṭiq and the Asas, that is the speaker prophet and the foundation, so Muhammad and Ali. In both texts, these two missions, these two functions are symbolized by the two trumpet blows of Israfil, which the Quran refers to. And both texts give us the same pun on the expression nafkh al-sur or nafkh al-suwar. And so the idea here is that when Israfil blows the trumpet, he gives life. The second blow is he gives life, which obviously the spiritual life, which means the esoteric knowledge. Finally, we have in both texts an interpretation of Quran 3:37 So I read the verse. Whenever Zachariah went to her to Mary in the sanctuary, he found her provisioned. Mary, he said, how comes this to thee? From God, she said. Again, the narrative is slightly different in detail. The ranks of the protagonists may differ, but the general framework is the same. Both Zachariah and Mary are members of the Dawah. Mary's provision is her access to esoteric knowledge, and what happens here is that she has received something that Zachariah does not know. So although in theory she is of a lower rank in the Dawah than Zachariah, actually she's from a higher rank because she received something that Zachariah did not teach her, because Mary had direct access to the hujjah, the proof of the Iman. Finally, I present my strongest argument in favor of a single authorship for these two works. In both works, the author mentions another book of his, which he names Usul al-Dīn fi Ma'rifat al-Ta'wil. So this book is unknown to us otherwise, so it's apparently lost. The author mentions the book twice in the Sarā'ir al-nuṭaqā, although in Ghalib's so-called edition, the first occurrence of the title of this book is incorrectly transcribed, as he transcribed it as Rusūm al-Dīn ila Ma'rifat al-Ta'wil instead of Usul al-Dīn. So this, the second occurrence in the Sarā'ir al-nuṭaqā was already noticed by David Hollenberg in his dissertation, but actually the Sarā'ir al-nuṭaqā contains another mention of this title, and it is also mentioned in the Ta'wil al-zakāt. So now, in light of the fact that these two works were written under the reign of Al-Mu'izz, which was precisely the one during which al-Sijistani acknowledged the Fatimids, one may wonder whether some of the features of these works may be connected to al-Sijistani's philosophy. And there are three main points I will make here due to the limitation of time, although more could be said. So let's start with the common cosmology between the Sarā'ir al-nuṭaqā and the Ta'wil al-zakāt on the one hand, and al-Sijistani and the Eastern Dawah in general on the other hand. So the Sarā'ir al-nuṭaqā and the Ta'wil al-zakāt contain this characteristic cosmology which characterizes, usually the Eastern Dawah, and this cosmology is absent again from the rest of the Ja'far corpus. So this is what this cosmology looks like. So again, you will not find this in any of Ja'far's other books. Another point that is common to Sarā'ir Ta'wil on the one hand and Sijistani on the other hand is the common use of a similar hermeneutic principle, according to which the apparent meaning of the Quran or of a hadith does not make sense, hence the necessity of ta'wil. So I'm less certain that the presence of this principle is indeed due to a Sijistanian connection, as I have also seen it in other sources, non-philosophical Ismaili sources, but also Nusayri sources. Yet it is very exceptional in these other sources, and the way this principle is formulated here in the Ta'wil al-zakāt and the Sarā'ir al-nuṭaqā seemed reminiscent to me of al-Sijistani rationalistic approach, which he presents in the chapter 12 of his Kitab al-Iftikhār, which was studied by Professor Poonawala in his article on Ismaili Ta'wil of the Quran. Finally, last but not least, the existence of a Sijistanian connection is demonstrated by the fact that the Ta'wil al-zakāt contains a quotation of a full chapter from al-Sijistani's Kitab al-Maqālīd. So the chapter is chapter 46 of the Kitab al-Maqālīd, how the angels take the forms of human beings. So I've checked the manuscripts of the Ta'wil al-zakāt. All four contain this passage in full. On the other hand, the Maqālīd, the edition that was beautifully made by Professor Poonawala, was based on two manuscripts. So I'm not sure I can answer the question, but the question is, which one is copying which? Is the author of the Ta'wil al-Zakāt copying from the Maqalid, or is it the other way around? So while I cannot answer this question, the fact that they share such a long passage, in addition to the other points they have in common, these texts, does show that there is a connection between these two traditions. So to my conclusions now. These two works, the Ta'wil al-Zakāt and the Sarā'ir al-nuṭaqā, display a strong authorship manifested by a certain intellectual independence, a highly elaborate system, a structured argument, a certain confidence of the author, and a strong sense of identity, and what I call individualism, which is the fact that the author refers to himself. He guides his reader by saying, we will explain this and that. I have said this in another book. Maybe I will try to explain this. So we are dealing with an author in the strong meaning of the term, and not just with notes from the Dawah, which would correspond more to the other books attributed to Jafar. So who is this author of the Sarā'ir al-nuṭaqā and Ta'wil al-Zakāt? So I've been calling him Ja'far too, because his style and doctrines are different from the others. So, but I'm not sure I can yet respond to the question of knowing whether we are dealing with a different author or with the same author, but at a later stage of his career. If it's not the same author as what I call the core group, then it is someone close to him, maybe his disciple, maybe his son, someone who was familiar with these earlier works of the corpus and the symbols of the Dawah. And indeed, I have found some connections between Sarā'ir and Ta'wil al-Zakāt on the one hand, and the Kitab al-Kashf, which I categorize as belonging to the core group. This author is apparently also very familiar with the Eastern ontology and the Neoplatonic concepts. So as a conclusion, I would like to call for more critical editions and studies of this corpus, because it is essential not only to know about one Fatimid author, but also to understand Fatimid history of thought in general, and its relationship to Neoplatonism in particular. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. We now have our second speaker, Dr. Maria Cillis from the Institute of Ismaili Studies on Ḥamīd, al-Dīn, al-Kimānī, and the Mustanṣir.
Thank you very much to the organizers of this conference and for all of you bearing till this late time. It's been a very challenging and very interesting conference so far. So what I will try to do in my talk, I will try to sketch what I identify as Kermani's relationship with Mu'tazilism. Now, this relationship is very vague, it's very opaque, I would define it. I will try to trace some what can be defined as rational approaches that really resemble Mu'tazilite propositions. However, I will not go to the extent of defining them as exactly Mu'tazilites, because al-Kermani's relationship with Mu'tazilism is really ambivalent, as it was for many, many other Shi'i authors. Now, the field, the area of research exploring and probing the relationship between Mu'tazilism and Shi'i Islam is very much still a desideratum. In the last 20 years, probably a little bit longer, there have been some progress made in the field, and some pivotal work has been carried out by Professor Madlung, by Professor Amir Moisi, and more recently also by Sabine Schmidtke. In particular, Sabine Schmidtke and David Clarn have been probing Jewish and Shi'i sources in order to identify through manuscripts, through Mu'tazilite manuscripts, some form of Shi'i connections in what has been defined as the Mu'tazilite project group. So why is this relationship still very much a desideratum? To this extent, actually, I would like to highlight that the IIS, in particular the Shi'i Studies unit, is planning to organize a colloquium on trying to really probe in more detail this very ambivalent relationship between Mu'tazili thought and Shia Islam. And hopefully I will be one of the conveners together with Professor Desmet and Dr. Miskin Soda. So as I was saying, this relationship is between Mu'tazili thought and Shia Islam is very, very difficult because of the nature of Mu'tazilism, because of the nature of Shia Islam. In his work on Mu'tazilism, Forbidding the Wrong, Michael Krohn defines Mu'tazilism as something that was to become a tradition of social and political disembodied intellection. And Mu'tazilism represented, according to Hossein Abdul Sattar, an allegiance to abstract propositions and a specific method of argumentation about God's nature and attributes, offering also an objectivist view of moral theory. So as such, Mu'tazilism was never associated with any specific religious community. So Mu'tazilism was absorbed by Sunnis, was somehow used and adapted by the Shia. We found it in the Zaydis, in the Hanafis, in the Imamis, and obviously also in the Jewish tradition. So what I've tried to do is just briefly try to analyze to what extent we can argue al-Kimānī is using Mu'tazilite thought, to what extent he thought Mu'tazilite ideas could have been used in order to satisfy his doctrinal and also political agenda. So al-Kimānī's writings sometimes seem to reflect a distinctive Mu'tazilite approach, and this is particularly valid. This point is particularly valid when we look at specific treatises, such as the Masabi fi al-Ithbat al-Imama. But in other treatises, such as the Tanbih al-Hadi wal-Mustadi, al-Kimānī is actually openly critical. He cites the Mu'tazilites, and he basically becomes very critical towards their views. He identifies the Mu'tazilites as the Zaydiyas, and compares the Mu'tazilite doctrines to the positions of the Magians in yet another treatise. In his golden saying, the golden sayings in al-Aqwal al-Habiyya, al-Kimānī binds intellectual reasoning to the necessity of the imamate and prophecy. He actually criticizes the views of the Mu'tazilites quite explicitly, and does so by using an argument had been used by his colleague Abu Hatim al-Razi, who had explicitly criticized the position of Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi. So I'm calling it a Mu'tazilite approach, but obviously this is just a simple way of putting it. So in al-Masabi fi al-Ithbat al-Imama, al-Kimānī resorts to the notion of God's justice. And he uses a very Mu'tazilite approach, he uses a very Mu'tazilite language, and he says something like, humans deserve the reward because humans are the source of good deeds that are suitable for the worship of God. And he goes on to explain that humankind, although is born with a predisposition towards goodness, which is a very Mu'tazilite stance, sometimes humans can be led to embrace evil stances. However, through acts of devotion, al-Kimānī tells us, humans can acquire virtues, and such acts of devotions, which are classified as good deeds, good actions, are necessary for the training of those souls who pursue the nobility of perfection. Now, one thing that we need to bear in mind is that for Ḥamīd al-Kirmani and some other representatives of the Ismaili Dawah within the Fatimid times, some philosophers like Abu Yaqub al-Sijistanis, there were different degrees of perfection. In particular, Ḥamīd al-Kirmani talks about 2 degrees of perfection. The first one, which is basically pure existence. So basically, by simply being alive, by simply being living beings, we have achieved our first perfection. The second perfection is accorded to different levels within the animal kingdom, within the mineral kingdoms, and so on, according to a providential plan. For humans, the things are slightly different. Humans subtract themselves to a kind of providential determinism because, according to Ḥamīd al-Kirmani, humans are ultimately free. And so somehow there is a resemblance with what was the hallmark of Mu'tazilite thought. We know that there were the advocates of free will versus the idea of divine predestination, which was espoused by the Ash'arites. And another very impressive, let's call it Mu'tazilat intervention, like Mu'tazilat approach, is when al-Kimānī, always in the same treatise, tells us that God has made the substance of the soul a life, a being capable of doing both good and evil, and of choosing between obedience and disobedience. Now, the language that is used here, the qadir, the fact that a soul or a human being can be identified as a qadir, as a human that is capable of choosing between good and evil, is obviously a very clear Mu'tazilat proposition. What is slightly different, and I will highlight it as I go on, is the importance, the fundamental necessitarian character that the Sharia, that the Islamic law plays within the work of Ḥamīd al-Kimānī, which obviously wasn't always the case for the Mu'tazilites. Again, in his treatise, al-Kimānī tells us that man is mostly essentially good, noble, and receptive of knowledge, and the soul's essence is still to be perceived as a locus for acquired understanding in being itself a substance. Now, within the Mu'tazilite thought, there were two different kinds of knowledges. One was considered to be a daruri, like a necessary knowledge, acquired almost instinctively, such as the proposition, injustice is evil. This is something that we can acquire instinctively. We don't need rational arguments to analyze this. But always within the Mu'tazilite thought, the Mu'tazilites also distinguish between a form of acquired knowledge, muqtasib knowledge, such as in the proposition, all lies are evil. This is not always the case, the Mu'tazilites would have required. It is necessary to appeal to rational argument in order to discern in which instances lies can be evil. Lies can be evil, for instance, when they don't bring any form of benefits or when they can cause harm. So in a sense, it is to this second kind of knowledge, this acquired knowledge, that Ḥamīd al-Kimānī's thought really appeals to. And obviously, this idea is integrated within the Ismaili paradigm, that this acquired knowledge, this necessary knowledge that would bring, this acquired knowledge that becomes necessary to attain salvation can be obtained only through the teaching of the Imams, only through the teachings of the prophets. Al-Kimānī tells us the human soul has the potentiality to acquire sufficient knowledge to redemption by following the guidance and the instruction of the spiritually chosen ones. So the Mu'ayyidun min as-Samā. Mu'ayyidun min as-Samā are obviously nothing else than the prophets and Imams who are the recipient of the ta'id, so the spiritual assistance coming from above, coming from the pleroma of the intellects. So far we've seen quite a few similarities between Ḥamīd al-Kimānī's thought and the Mu'tazila's approaches. But a very important shift, as I mentioned, is actually identifiable in al-Kimānī really distancing himself from what the Mu'tazila would have said in the sense of the dispensability of revelation. Al-Kimānī tells us the soul has the power to act and the capacity of choosing between obedience and disobedience, so that it is rewarded or punished accordingly. The human species, however, has been made legally capable through command and prohibition. So the human soul requires external instructions, and as Professor Walker has indicated, a program of habituation, instilling in the soul the virtues such as wisdom, purity, and probity, and without which it cannot achieve these things by itself. Such qualities are obtainable through the acts prescribed by the revealed law rather than by sheer philosophical speculation. Now, al-Kimānī tells us throughout the Raḥtul Aql, but also in other different treatises, that the repositories of the teachings that are coming from the world of the soul, i.e. the world of holiness, are the recipient of an emanation that is bequeathed in the form of regulations, rasum, and utterances, aqwal, which in turn are brought forward by the messengers as laws and scriptures. So he is very direct in trying to highlight the absolute indispensability of the Sharia, of the law, of the divine law. Divine laws, he tells us, are necessary, cannot be obliterated, since they are the objectified facet of that wisdom and knowledge that is converted into attainable forms of sensation, such as letters and written precepts. Now, yet again, al-Kimānī strives also to always tries to underline the absolute indispensability of the law, the divine law, and obviously the absolute indispensability of the imamate. And he makes a lot of effort in trying to demonstrate that this world is the world of deeds, is the world of acquisition. Acquisition, obviously, of knowledge that is dispensed through the prophets and through the imams. And it tells us, because the reward is the result of good action, it can be stipulated that actions are prior to the recompense, with the latter required to be deserved by divine justice. So this is a very rational approach, which, I mean, astonishingly resembles the Mu'tazilite approach. The recompense is granted only in relation to a previous acquisition, which is the outcome of deeds or thoughts. Because there is no other way, he informs us, for the soul to acquire action if not through the individual's bodily manifestation, not to acquire thoughts and beliefs if not through instructions and postulates, which are all in this world, it becomes clear that our world is indeed the abode of acquisition. Now, Ḥamīd al-Kimānī becomes very critical, however, on the Mu'tazilite stances in different other occasions. For instance, in his treatise Risalat Mabasim al-Bisharat bil-Ihmam al-Hakim, which actually uses to prove the original state of purity and goodness in mankind, al-Kimānī establishes a series of parallelisms, and he compares Ali, actually he opposes Ali to the Jews, he opposes the 12ers to the Christians, and he compares the Mu'tazilites to the Magians, and he says nobody is further away from the truth and from salvation than the Magians, but obviously inferring that also the Mu'tazilites were far from the truth, far from salvation. So it becomes very difficult to really understand to what extent he liked the Mu'tazilites and to what extent he was able to absorb their thoughts. In his golden sayings, Ḥamīd al-Kimānī again becomes extremely critical of what Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria Razi had stated in his At-Tibr Ruhani regarding the understanding of the aql, the understanding of reasoning as the only guide towards salvation. And what he does, al-Kimānī uses the same arguments, even the same language that had been used by Razi, and criticizes it. So I'm just proposing here a brief excerpt from his work. So it is right, and it has been already established that the aql is the most beneficent of blessings to us. It is that by which we can comprehend this world and the next, not by our own intellects, as Muhammad Zakaria Razi had stated, but indeed by the Prophet's intellects. It has been said that our intellects are in potentiality, for it is an attribute of our intellects to have an instructed perfection, which is attainable through inspiration, spiritual support, and belief, and through which they, that is to say our intellects, pursue the truth, and without which they are misled from the truth, in what sea have drowned the pronouncers of deduction, and those who are shackled by the idea of attaining perfection through their own intellects, for they are turned off from attaining the benefits from the blessings of the perfection which is prophetic, and are turned towards the limited idle knowledge which is worldly, in their foolishness to choose evil. So obviously this is quite a clear criticism towards towards those who believed that human intellects can attain salvation by themselves, without any necessity, without any need of revelation. The argument that had been put forward by Zakaria Razi regarding the nature of prophecy, and so on. So the aql, what is the aql for al-Kimānī, is what the Latin intellectus is. is a mean to attain salvation, not independently from revelation, not independently from the teaching of the prophets and imams. I will be very, very brief. Again, another very clear criticism towards the Mu'tazilat, and in this case, the Mu'tazilats, when Ḥamīd al-Kimānī criticizes them, the name Mu'tazila is there. The Mu'tazilats, on their misled path towards doubt and error, are accused of having centered their speculative theological apparatus merely on the importance of action, thus overlooking the double form of worship by deeds and knowledge, which is crucial to Ḥamīd al-Kimānī's thought. The Mu'tazilat, he tells us, have embraced views similar to those who, like the Zaydiyya, have denied the absolute bounding authority of Muhammad's designation of his successor. Similar to the people of demonstration and speculation, the philosophers perhaps, the Mu'tazilites argued for the superiority of reason and the latter's capacity to deduce rules relative to the worship of God beyond the prescriptions of the religious law or the guidance of a teacher. So just to conclude, it seems quite clear that, let's say, all in all, al-Kimānī was able to absorb some of Mu'tazilat's, what we can identify as Mu'tazilat's outlooks without compromising, however, the outright Ismaili nature of his soteriological plan. It would have been quite unseemingly to propound anything different, for instance, from the idea that humans are responsible for their own actions, if he needed to emphasize the absolute indispensability of the law as a divine principle of discernment and knowledge to knowledge and deeds. But yet again, this criticism towards the nature of the Aql as an absolute way to attain salvation, or any propositions of the dispensability of the law, the dispensability of prophethood, are clearly condemned. Thank you.
Thank you. We now have our third speaker, Dr. Omar Alí-de-Unzaga from the Institute of Ismaili Studies, talking on a paper on commentary and interpretation of the Qur'an, Tafsīr and Ta'wil in the sessions of wisdom at the Fatimid Court of al-Mustanṣir.
Sorry. Thank you. Today I plan to do two things. I will first deliver a paper, and at the end I intend to announce a project on Quranic citations in Ismaili literature. The paper is divided into three parts: the state of the field on Ismaili verse-by-verse commentary on the Quran. Second part is on the Majalis al-Mustanṣiriyya and its architecture. And the third part are on the strategies dealing with tafsir in the Majalis al-Mustanṣiriyya. As for the state of the field, the first problem we encounter when trying to study Ismaili interpretation of specific Quranic verses is the lack of indexes. Not only thematic indexes or indexes of names and subjects, but specifically indexes of Quranic citations and also of hadith. So all of you who are working on text, please include indexes of Quranic citations. The very exercise of trying to find a specific Quranic verse in an Ismaili work is exhausting, let alone attempting to do that over a number of works. Thus, comparing the use and interpretation of specific verses across books becomes a discouraging enterprise. The searching a needle in a haystack analogy comes to mind. This is specifically poignant given that the usual tendency of Ismaili authors is to allude to Quranic ayahs as dictated by the subject at hand and according to the topic being discussed, rather than in any sequential order. I shall come back later on how we can put a remedy to this problem. A legitimate question that may be asked is, why is it that of all the Islamic denominations, the Ismailis stand out for not having developed a tradition of tafsir writing, that is, of producing verse-by-verse commentaries? It could be argued that it is the very presence of the Imam that renders scholastic scriptural exegesis unnecessary. After all, one of the most important specifications of the Imam's job description, so to speak, is imparting the inner meaning of the revealed message. In other words, there is a certain incompatibility between tafsir writing and the presence of the Imam. as is also the case with, say, Ithna Ashri Shi'is, when the Imam is present. However, the physical figure of the Imam has not always been present, hadir or mawjud, in all eras and according to all Ismaili branches, most notably in the Tayyibi branch. In response, it may be argued that the person of the Da'i Mutlaq substitutes for the Imam's role of explaining the Quran, again making the need for tafsir expendable. At this point, I would like to make two important remarks. First, there is at least one tafsir produced by an Ismaili author. This is the 6th, 12th century Mafatih al-Asrar of Abdul Karim al-Shahrastani, although it must be conceded that the Ismaili affiliation of the author has not been definitely settled. And questions on Shahrastani's relationship with the Nizaris of the early Alamūt period continue to exist. The extant parts of this tafsir cover Surah al-Fatiha and al-Baqarah, i.e. near 1/12 or 8% of the Qur'an, as per the word count. It is not known whether the original covered more ground. Secondly, the practice of providing some kind of commentary on long series of consecutive verses and even whole surahs is indeed found in Ismaili literature. One of the most notable examples of this is the work known as al-Majalis al-Mustanṣiriyya, or the sessions delivered during the time of the Imam Caliph al-Mustanṣir billah, which is the subject of this paper. Other authors who perform sequential verse-by-verse ta'wil include notably Ja'far bin Manṣūr al-Yaman and Hibatullah al-Mu'ayyad fi Din al-Shirazi, as we heard in Tahir al-Qutbuddin's paper. Ja'far bin Manṣūr al-Yaman interprets Surah al-Nisa with 176 verses, verse by verse, Surah al-Yusuf with 111 verses, and Surah al-Kahf. I forgot how many verses. I didn't note it. As symbolic prefigurations of the Ismaili imamate and the da'wah organization of his time. Al-Mu'ayyad, in turn, in his monumental collection of 800 sessions, Al-Majalis al-Mu'ayyadiyya, which is now completely available in print, albeit in non-critical form, interprets Surah al-Fatiha, verses 1 to 107 of al-Baqarah, over 54 sessions in sequence. And again, the first 25 verses of the Fatiha, the first 25 verses of the Baqarah over a different 56 sessions. He also interprets Surah al-Qaf, which has 45 verses over 45 sessions. And Surah al-Tariq with 17 verses over 2 sessions. This is upon an initial inspection of volumes 1 to 4. Volumes 5 to 8 remain to be included in the present analysis. The importance of the Majalis al-Mu'ayyadiyya cannot be overemphasized, as it can be considered, as we have seen, the main repository of Ismaili ta'wil on the Quran. In later centuries, especially from the 12th, 18th centuries in Tayyibi circles, various materials from the golden Fatimid period were gathered and reassembled in the form of verse-by-verse commentaries. Thus, we find two notable works in this style. The Mizaj al-Tasnim by Diyauddin Ismail ibn Hibatullah, who dies in 1770, the 33rd Sulaymani Da'i Mutlaq in Yemen, whose surviving text, published from one manuscript by Rudolf Strothmann between 1944 and 1955, includes an esoteric paraphrase from surahs 9 to 29, which amount to 1/3 of the Quran, covering the juz numbers 11 to 20, i.e. 10 of the 30 juz or ajza or parts in which the Quran is often divided. And also we have a work called Tafsīr al-Qur'an, containing the teachings of Izzuddin Muhammad ibn Jivanji Aurangabadi, the 44th Dawoodi Da'i, who died in 1821, which is found in manuscript 1547 of the Hamdani manuscript, now housed at the IIS. This work, this Tafsīr al-Qur'an, covers the commentary from surahs 1 to 17. And to these two, we might add an anonymous Tafsīr al-Qur'an, possibly dating from the late 19th or early 20th century, from also the Hamdani collection in 2 manuscripts divided in various parts corresponding to the various juz of the Qur'an. Between both copies of this work, they contain 29 juz of the Qur'an, i.e. the whole text, a tafsir of the whole Qur'an except for the first juz. The value of this work is that it mentions the authorities from which the commentary is taken. The publication and analysis of these 3 works will be of great help to scholars and others and will represent an important contribution to the study of Ismaili approaches to the Qur'an. Just going to check my time. 2 other minor verse-by-verse ta'wil works focus on individual surahs, respectively Surat Yasin and Surat Kahf. I will skip over the details. So, moving to the Majalis al-Mustanṣiriyya and its architecture. I couldn't fit this architecture in a PowerPoint, so I have asked Noshin to display a Prezi presentation. I'm not going to discuss the issues of authorship or dating. Those will go into the, hopefully, written part of this work, of this paper. I'll just focus on the contents and the structure. The work belongs to the Fatimid genre of majalis, sermons or sessions, and seems to have been addressed to base level initiates. Additionally, 2 of the sessions address women in the audience, which seems to have been a mixed audience, although it's difficult to tell. The work consists of 35 sessions. Thanks to internal evidence, we know that these were lectures delivered weekly for 9 months, beginning at the beginning of an unspecified Islamic year, i.e. from Muharram to Ramadan. Other internal and external evidence can help us establish the issues of dating and authorship, but as I said, I'm not going to cover this now. Far from being a casual, improvised, or spontaneous, these 35 lectures betray a highly sophisticated planning and a carefully crafted structure that amounts to what we would call today a full year course. Do we call it that? I don't know. I would call it a full year course over 9 months. There you go. The architecture of the work is as follows. Except the introductory sessions 1 and 2, each majlis consists of 2 parts, which run on parallel throughout the text. One part outlines the obligatory duties, fara'id, and the customary practices, sunan, binding on believers, and the other part consists of a systematic verse-by-verse running commentary on Surat al-Fatiha, Surat al-Alaq, and Surat al-Baqarah, up to verse 74, covering in total 100 Quranic verses. The author quotes a hadith of the Prophet where he is reported to have said that reciting the phrase La ilaha illallah, there is no God but God, with true fidelity or sincerity, ikhlas, means being cognizant of 2 things, the degrees and the duties that are related to it. The degrees and the duties, or the ranks and the duties, the hudud and the huquq. So the author begins with the explanation of this hadith by pointing to, by explaining what are these hudud and these huquq, what are these ranks or degrees or hierarchies, ranks, and what are these duties. To explain this, the author makes recourse to numerology, which plays a very important role throughout the work, with numbers 7 and 12, and of course 19, taking center stage. The writing of La ilaha illallah consists of 7 independent segments in the Arabic and 12 letters. Right, so La, Alif, La, that's 3, Alif, 4, La, 5, Alif, 6, and the rest 7. And 12 letters, so that makes 19. Until now, we don't know why 19. In view of this, the degrees are interpreted in typical Fatimid Ismaili fashion, as the 7 imams of every cycle and their 12 lieutenants or proofs, hujjas. This is the whole architecture. So we focus on the 7 imams and the 12 hujjas organized in cycles. And the duties are interpreted as being the 7 obligatory duties, fara'id, or pillars, if you want, and the 12 customary practices, sunan, 19 in total again. In turn, each of those duties and practices consist of 19 components, 7 duties and 7 customary practices for each of them. So you have that kind of big architecture that I showed you. The result is a complex net based on number 19. Now, the reason why the author is very keen to exploit the symbology of number 19 is that he considers the contemporary Imam, al-Mustanṣir billah, as the number 19. Now, this implies that both Ali and Hussein are counted as Imams. So the Imams of the first cycle would be Ali, Hassan, Hussein, Zain al-Abidin, Muhammad al-Baqir, Jafar al-Sadiq, Ismail. Second cycle, and the third cycle, you have Al-Mu'izz, Al-Aziz, Al-Hakim, Al-Zahir, Al-Mustanṣir would be the 19th. He makes a point of this. Now, I would love to open a discussion as to whether this is irregularity or whether the author is playing with some kind of license to count Ali and Hussein and Hassan as Imams because it fits with the symbology, or whether it is incompatible with the idea that there was some kind of evolution between the establishment or the declaration of Ali as Asas and the rest of the Imams as Imams, and the position of Hassan and Hussein. And this is not discussed here. Okay. As for the duties, the 7 obligatory duties are walaya, tahara, salat, zakat, saum, hajj, jihad, and the 12 customary sunan, okay, customary practices, or duties to parents, duties to relatives, duties to neighbors, etc. I will go back to that, and I'll focus on finishing by mentioning in my remaining 5 minutes or 3 minutes the fact that I wanted to look at, first of all, in going through this text, you encounter quite, maybe my expectation was low, but what I encountered was a high number of mentions of tafsir and mufassirun, Sunni tafsir, min al-amma. So I looked at each one of them and trying to see what was the positioning of the author vis-a-vis these tafsirs. Does he use them to contradict them, or does he use them to build on them? In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over all of the 15 cases where he encounters tafsirs. My methodology was I identified the mentions of the tafsir and the mufassirun. I identified the Quranic citations that were being discussed. I went to about 24 different tafsirs up to the mid-400s, al-Wahidi being the latest. And I also consulted other tafsirs, and then I identified the positioning of the author vis-a-vis each one of these tafsirs. But I have no time to go into the details. So I'll walk you to my conclusions, which are working conclusions. Of these 15 encounters with tafsirs in the work, only 5 provide a negative attitude towards Sunni tafsir. This was a surprise to me. Maybe my expectation was wrong. Or maybe it had to do with the type of audience that was being addressed. I'm not sure yet. We can identify 6 strategies. 3 are positive and 3 are negative, although the positives are higher in number. The positive strategies are what I call inclusive approach. So he displays 1, 2, 3, or 4 interpretations, and he merges all of them. And he usually says, well, the mufassirun are right, but all of them are right at the same time. And he develops a strategy to explain why all of them are right. The second strategy, the second positive strategy, is appeal to consensus. In 3 occasions, so the inclusive approach he follows in 5 occasions. In 3 occasions, he follows what I call appeal to consensus. He says the Sunni mufassirun agree on this, and he builds on that. Sometimes he gets that wrong because when I checked, there is no consensus. But he is using that strategy of the consensus. In one occasion, he selects one of the possible interpretations as true, and then he builds on it. As for the negative part of the strategies, we find 3 where he critiques or even ridicules the tafsirs for getting the interpretation wrong. In one occasion, he selects one of 2 options, but he critiques the other one really strongly. And the third negative strategy is he rejects a prevalent reading, a specific qira'ah. Okay? So, to finish, there is a constant interaction with other interpretations in this text. It is an Ismaili text, but there is constant interaction with other interpretations. Sorry, stop, cancel. Yes, can you stop that? Yes, thank you. These interpretations are not always dismissed. Some of them are only briefly alluded to, but our research can open up what exactly is being alluded to. So we could expect that the audience is somehow familiar with the tafsirs, perhaps not. We can identify many of the interpretations that it's a he, or maybe, no, we don't know, that the author points to by looking at the tafsirs available to us. Whether the audience was familiar with these interpretations or not is a question to explore. And perhaps, I go back to one of my early points, perhaps this is a work of initiation. In any case, it is inescapable for us that in order to fully understand these texts, we must read them alongside tafsirs. This is my main conclusion, that in order to understand this text, we must read it alongside tafsirs. Otherwise, you will not understand what is being referred to. So if I have a minute, I would like to announce a project which I'm calling QCIL. Can you pronounce that? QCIL? I'm still coming up with a pronounceable name. This is Quranic citations in Ismaili literature. I'm using literature in the way that Ismail Punawala and Farhad Aftari have used Ismaili literature, and Ivanov. So, but I know that these concepts can be critiqued. What happens if you are not so fortunate as to dealing with a text which does not have a sequential commentary of verses? Okay, what can you do? What to do when verses and their commentary are dispersed through texts and across texts? Here is what I have. Here is what I have developed with the help of some scholars like Fârès Gillon, Karim Javan in Saskatchewan, and others. So it's an online project that will allow you to subscribe. It will allow you to see the 114 surahs of the Quran. You can, if you're looking by surah, you can click on one of them, or if you're looking by author, you can also click on at the top, the top tab, authors and works. If you're interested in one of them, you can click on one of them. Okay, so if you click on Quranic citations, for example, Surah 3, you can type verse 7. Okay, this is not a live demonstration; it's only a PDF. Okay, but I hope to make this project live very soon and provide all of you with passwords so that you can try it out. It'll be a trial period, and we can get feedback and improve the project and make it nice and looking, elegant. At the moment, it's very, raw. So if you click 7, you will see 3:7. This is the Rasikhun fil Ilm verse, has been cited by all these authors. But if you look at specific authors, you can also do that. This is the Haft Bab by Abu Ishaq Kohestani. Okay, and once you click on them, then you will be able to see the specific verse. I have merged 2 different screens. At the moment, we cannot merge these 2, but you will get either the translation or the edition, or I hope to have both. Okay, the arrows are also not in the project yet. I have just added them for you to see. This is Surah An-Nisa, verse 59. Ati'u Allah wa ati'u Rasula wa ulil amri minkum. Okay, that's the translation by Ivanov, and this is the edition by Ivanov himself. Okay, so hopefully this will allow us to then identify specific verses across works and then the work will be yours. It will be yours to compare. Compare with Mu'tazila, compare with Tafsīrs, and compare across Ismaili works. So there you go. That's a gift to you.
Thank you very much. The last speaker for this session and today is Dr. Karim Javan from the Institute of Ismaili Studies, speaking on the unfolding of the Proclamation of the Qiyāma in Alamūt. 11th. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers of the conference for organizing this very fascinating conference. I'm going to take you to the fortress of Alamūt, basically, and away from all the theological discussions that we had in this panel. For this presentation, I'm going to discuss a few questions which basically address the reasons that necessitated the proclamation of the resurrection in Alamūt and the conditions that prepared the ground for the event in Alamūt. And for this purpose, after a summary of the Qiyāma proclamation in Alamūt, I will discuss the theological framework of this event. The historical context of this event is something that has been rarely discussed. Relying on some sources close to the time of the proclamation, I will shed some light on the social context in which this extraordinary event took place. And finally, I will present some insight into the aftermath of the Qiyāma era in Alamūt and how this era was perceived and remembered during the post-Alamūt era. What was the proclamation of resurrection? 2 years after the accession of Hassan al-Salam or Hassan II to power as the leader of the Nizari state in Alamūt, on 17th of Ramadan, 559, 8th of August 1164, he ordered a pulpit to be set up in the Musalla below the castle of Alamūt. 4 flags in 4 colors were ordered to be erected on each corner of the minbar, white, red, green, and yellow, representing different Nizari communities. At around noon, Hassan II came down from the castle in white garment and turban and ascended the pulpit minbar. He announced that he had a message from the hidden Imam in which the Imam had appointed him as his deputy Khalifa and declared that he had graciously exempted them from the bindings or aghlal of the Sharia and had caused them to attain the Qiyāma. He declared the day as Eid al-Qiyam and the beginning of a new era, the Qiyāma era. Although he called himself the deputy of the Imam, many already believed that he was the Imam himself, even before his accession to power. He was considered to be the first Ismaili Imam in Alamūt ever since. First, we're going to look at similar events in Ismaili history. The appearance of Imams in Ismaili history before this have been marked as beginning of a new era, ending the Sadr period and starting an era of religious renewals. The first event is the rise of Abdullah al-Mahdi in North Africa and the establishment of the Fatimid state in which was Ramadan 297-909. A similar event took place in the Barmati state of Bahrain when an Isfahani young man was identified as the Qa'im in Ramadan 319 September 931, as was predicted in the Ismaili Dawah teachings. And the third example is the case of the Druze movement, during which Hamza bin Ali, the leader of this movement, claimed to be the Qa'im, ending the era of Sharia in Ramadan 411. 11-10-21. In all of these events, the appearance of the Qa'im Mahdi signified a new era known as Kashf. It is also worth noting that only the Garmatis did not recognize Abdullah al-Mahdi, the founder of the Fatimid Caliphate, but the Druze and the Nazaris acknowledged Abdullah al-Mahdi as the first Imam of Dawr al-Kashf. What was the Qiyāma and who is the Qa'im? All these Qiyāma events were understood on the basis of an established Ismaili theological framework, which is cyclical periodization of prophethood from Adam to Qa'im. By the emergence of the Qa'im as the seventh Naṭiq or Saber Tam, the cycle of religion is completed and returns to its beginning, which is the era of Adam. For this reason, the early Ismaili writers, Da'is, believed that the Qiyāma era will be similar to the era of Adam. This idea is also shared by Sijistani and Abu Hatim al-Razi, according to his Kitab al-Islah. Although al-Razi wrote this book in opposition to Nasafi's ideas on the Qa'im and the state of the Sharia during the seventh Naṭiq, the difference in their interpretation of the notion is minimal. Nasafi believed that Adam did not bring any Sharia, and the era of Adam and the final Naṭiq or Qa'im are the same in this respect. Al-Razi did not agree and refused to lay great emphasis on the lack of Sharia in the era of Adam. Is Mahdi different from the Qa'im? The issue of Qa'im Mahdi and his function is an important issue in Ismaili theology. Before the establishment of the Fatimid Caliphate, the standard Ismaili position was that the Mahdi and the Qa'im were one person. However, it seems that Abdullah al-Mahdi suggested that they are in fact two different figures. According to Mahdi's function would be concluded with his political victory and would not need to extend to any reform of the Sharia. Harm suggests that it was probably on this basis he called his son al-Qa'im to postpone the religious reforms expected from him to the future. In his letter to his Yemeni Da'i and Manṣūr al-Yaman, and al-Mahdi quotes a hadith from Jafar al-Sadiq that indicates he believed that the Mahdi and the Qa'im were two different characters with different functions. Therefore, the ideological reforms of the Qa'im upon his arrival were never fulfilled and remained overdue, especially in areas outside the Fatimid power. Now, possible reasons for the Qiyāma proclamation in Alamūt. In this context, the reasons for the proclamation of resurrection in Alamūt seem more understandable. In his Siyasat-Nameh, Nizam al-Mulk writes that at the earliest stages of the Ismaili Da'wah in Tabaristan, where Abu Hatim al-Razi was the chief Da'i, Ismaili Da'i, people were expecting the Mahdi to emerge at a certain time. But the prediction did not materialize, and he had to flee from the region since his people turned against him. This suggests that the reappearance of the Qa'im and the expected reforms were important factors in the theological presentation of the Da'wah to different communities, which created equal expectations among them. On the same basis, the initiation of the Nizari Da'wah by Hasan Sabbah in the region created similar expectations. In Hafbab, there is a passage quoting Hasan Sabbah who says, when the Qa'im emerges, he will sacrifice a camel and raise a red flag. Then he will destroy the castles and remove the secrecy veil, parde-i taqiyyah, of the Sharia. Furthermore, Hasan Sabbah's doctrine of ta'lim was founded on the idea of the presence of the Ismaili Imam. Therefore, such period could not go on forever. This could be one of the reasons that many Nizaris during the reign of Muhammad ibn Qiyā Umid came to believe that Hasan alayhi salam was actually the Imam. Despite the strong opposition of Muhammad ibn Qiyā Umid, many continue to believe that. There are Ismaili accounts from this period that accuse Muhammad ibn Qiyā Buzurg Ummid of murdering the Imam and the father of alayhi salam, and detail the signs of Imam matching those of alayhi salam according to Sayyidina's sayings. As another precondition for the proclamation of Qiyāma, the military success of the Nizaris by this time should not be underestimated. When Hassan II took over from Muhammad ibn Buzurg Ummid in 1162, the Nizaris had been able to capture many castles in Rudbar and Daylam area, and even build new castles in their territories, which consolidated their power despite a strong opposition of the enemies. By the end of Alamūt by the end of Muhammad ibn Qiyā Buzurg Ummid reign, not only the Nizaris had established their power at Alamūt, but they had also begun to expand into the neighboring areas. This was probably as a sign for the arrival of the promised. What was the actual message? In order to understand the meaning of the proclamation and what Hassan alayhi salam understood from the new era, it is important to look at the remaining literature related to this event. According to Ismaili sources such as Baba Abu Ishaq Kohestani, after reading a khutbah, sermon, alayhi salam said that God has blessed the faithful and removed the Sharia obligations from them. In the Arabic khutbah that he read out to Nizaris, he said, "Arise, the resurrection of all resurrection is upon you. Today, God does not guide through signs and symbols. Today is not known through the signs, speeches, allusions, and physical worships. Today, the deeds, the speeches, the signs, and the differences reach their final end." This is a clear reference to the ritualistic nature of worship according to Sharia, which was going to transform into non-formal and pure spiritual form of worship. As text by Hassan alayhi salam himself on the concept of Qiyāma, there is a letter of Hassan II in which he explains his understanding of the Qiyāma through Quranic verses in response to questions asked by a certain Qiyā Shah Amir, which is part of a manuscript in the Tehran University. The questions are on the interpretation of different verses of the Qur'an with references to Islamic eschatology, especially the famous surah of Takwir, where God says, when the sun with its spacious light is folded up, when the stars fall, losing their luster. He says that this means the light of 7 pillars of Sharia and Tanzil will be disappeared by the sunlight of the Ta'bil world, which is the Qiyāma world. The rise of the dead from their graves mentioned in the Qur'an is also interpreted as spiritual awakening. Accordingly, all verses in the Qur'an on Qiyāma are interpreted with the same approach. Qiyāma, the word of Wahdat or unity. As a result of the proclamation of resurrection, Nizaris believe that all differences in religious practices will disappear in light of their perfection rather than abrogation of laws. However, the believers should climb up the gradation ladder starting from Kawn Tazad to Kawn Wahdat, which is the ultimate stage. In one of the fusuls, most likely by Hassan alayhi salam himself, which details different stages of a spiritual journey from an Ismaili, for an Ismaili, it says the sign of unity is that it does not fit except in pure hearts. In this stage, one should consider haram, whatever is halal in Sharia, and leave behind water and food in such a way that there is nothing mixed of the two stages. If someone partially acts according to Wahdat and partially on Sharia, it will result in infidelity, mushriki. When one finds this ability in himself, he has reached the stage of unity and on the path of submission. What was exactly abrogated? Based on remaining passages of Fusul from the Alamūt period, the main subject of Raf' Aghlal al-Shari'at, or removing the chains of obligations in the Qiyāma era, was the ritualistic aspects of Sharia. In one of these fasts, we read, if the whole Sharia is abrogated, there will be shortcomings among people, and many illegitimate haram cases will emerge in situations with no Sharia rule, siyasat shar'i. You should know that Sharia is partially rational, aqli, and partially conventional, waz'i. The rational part is irremovable, and the conventional cases are as ablution, prayer, alms, and pilgrimage could be removed. Ending the Qiyāma era. In 607-1210, Jalaluddin Hassan III succeeded Alauddin Muhammad and ended the Qiyāma era and acknowledged the Sunni Islam, and therefore he was called no Musalman. His reign became known as the era of political taqiyya, during which they could normalize their relationship with the Sunni Caliphate of Baghdad and consequently their neighboring local rulers. However, the theology of Qiyāma continued to inspire Nizari authors and ordinary believers. Later perspectives of these policies. The remaining literature from the Alamūt period that are known to us rarely provide an explanation about the whole events of proclaiming the Qiyāma and consequently ending it. However, all these episodes projected theologically for Nizaris. However, all these episodes projected theologically for the Nizaris. The only text that provides some insight on this is a newly discovered Risala on the Ahd Sayyidna, which wraps up all the stages from the Alazir Salam to Jalaluddin Hassan as follows. Maulana Alazir Salam opened the door and revealed all the truth and secrets that were hidden to the people of both worlds from Azal to Abad, like a candle that shines in the dark and the sun that comes out of clouds. Then Maulana Muhammad ibn Alazir Salam elucidated the matter so that it was acknowledged in all corners of the world. When the final stage of acknowledgement, Ta'eed, reached its peak and completion, the Lord of the Truth, Maulana Hassan ibn Muhammad, Jalaluddin Hassan, peace be upon his mention, revealed the mabda' of the current da'wat and brought in the Islamic Sharia, so that people know that haq or truth would be haq when it is with muhiq. Qiyāma expectations in the post-Alamūt period. By the collapse of the Nizari state of Alamūt, a new era of Sats started, and the Nizari community awaited the reappearance of the Imam for a long period. The limited literature remained from the post-Alamūt period in manuscript collections of the community shed some light on many aspects of religious and social life of the Nizaris in different regions. Among this body of literature, we come across texts that inform us that the reappearance of the Imams at the end of each Satr era raised expectations of a new Qiyāma era. Two examples of such expectations are mentioned here. The first case is the reappearance of Imam Mustanṣir II, which was characterized as the beginning of a new Qiyāma era in the following poems by a poem called Hassan. این ظهور دور کشف است ای رفیقان آشکار حمله آریدن در این میدان دین ایاروار چون قیامت گشت ظاهر بایدت بشتافتند هم بهشت و دوزخ است آنجا ز روی اعتبار. This poem has wrongfully been inserted in the Diwan Qa'imiyat, but it's not by Hassan Mahmud. The terms such as Zuhur, Qiyamat, and Kashf are clear indications of this view. In another poem by an unknown author, we read مهدی وقت کو به کرامات سرمدی ایام راز نور قیامت شعار داد نجل بزرگوار سلام الله که او دین راز ملک مرتبه کامکار داد. This is a clear reference to Mustanṣir II as the son of Salamullah. The second case is Zulfiqar Ali and again a new Kashf era. The same expectations were raised at the beginning of the term of Imam Zulfiqar Ali, which is a surprise. In the following poems, he is referred to as the Qa'im Mahdi. دوش این ندای دولتم از آسمان رسید داد این خبر که مهدی آخر زمان رسید. I skipped just the poems. This is by a certain poet called Karimi, but it's worth mentioning that we have not been aware of any such period before this Imam. So this is of historical value as well. Conclusion. Some general remarks for the conclusion. In conclusion, at the end of each such era, the expectations of religious renewal spread among the Nizari Ismailis in Iran. These expectations could be considered an indication of aspirations for social, political, and ideological change in the community. One could argue that these aspirations for change were perhaps the driving force for various religious reforms that were introduced in later periods within the Nizari Ismaili community. Thank you very much.